to spend time. Well, I'm sure it'll be fascinating. Anyway, thank you, Quinn. We're looking forward to the talk.
40 minutes. I'll spend 10 minutes on one hole.
Oh, great. So it breaks down very easily.
Okay. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah. You can just use the arrows.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's not comatose from their turkey sandwiches, for those who had them. Thank you very much for having me back again here in Watkins Glen. Love coming back. So today I'm actually going to, kind of talk about, something that struck me is, we hear stories and then, it kind of got me to thinking about really this, almost like a domino effect of, things happening. It's like, well, okay, I've heard tales of this, but then what caused that to happen? And that's kind of my basis for this talk. And so, on occasion, I find myself in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. I take my motorsport history class there after we kind of do our NASCAR history segment in the class, and it's always a fantastic time. And one of the things I noticed, kind of going through and part of their marketing structure, and even part of the museum itself, is, this is actually the magnet off my fridge. I decided to, take a photo of it and put it up on the billboard here. But it's before there was speed, there was shine. And so, as we can see, that there's not really a shiny car being represented in there. There's a bottle of alcohol. And so, that got me thinking. It was like, oh, okay, so why was there shine before speed? What was the cause of this? And so that kind of perked my mind and kind of how we went through it. And even in the NASCAR Hall of Fame, there are tales of Junior Johnson, who I got to know on occasion working with the Speedway, that there's a display in the NASCAR Hall of Fame that is a still itself. So it's a moonshine still, it's set up, and at first, Junior Johnson, they had approached him and said, hey, we want to do kind of a section that has a moonshine still in it. Can you contribute anything? And he said, hold one sec. And he went ahead and built a still. He built a still, and he sent it to the NASCAR Hall of Fame. And he said, okay, here you go. And they sort of turned around, and they looked at him and said, how do we put it together? And he said, hold on. And so he came down, and he assembled the thing himself. And to this day, it's said that he claims that if as long as you light a fire under it and put the right ingredients in, it will produce alcohol at the other end. So, a fully functional still is what he delivered, per his knowledge of the product and his history with it. And from this, this whole entire, before there was speed, there was shine, there also kind of comes about, this era of, the Winston Cup Series. It was with us for 30 odd years. And well, why was the Winston, part of NASCAR? And that kind of, there's two regulatory changes that I'm going to be talking about: prohibition under the 18th Amendment and the 1970 Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act. And these two changes basically, I kind of posit that they were the reason that NASCAR was created, and also, the second one was how it was maintained, and also IMSA benefited from it as well during this time period too. So let's get into it. So bootlegging and prohibition. The 18th Amendment is ratified in 1920, and that makes it basically illegal for all alcohol to be sold, to be distributed, to be produced. Well, people, Americans like their alcohol, and even though it had become illegal, there was quite a need and want for alcohol. And, well, there were plenty of folks up in the mountains and foothills of North Carolina and Georgia and parts of the South that were willing to fulfill this need. They had already been producing alcohol on their own, and typically, on a small batch scale type, but once the nation was deprived of alcohol, their operations ramped up to quite a large level. And so most of these stills that were, these hidden distilleries, require wood, fire, heat, and time to be produced, to produce alcohol. And typically the smoke would be rising up, so revenuers or sheriffs were able to see this smoke and sort of pick out where these hidden distilleries were. And so the majority of the time these were produced, the production would take place at night or under the light of the moon, is kind of where we get this whole term of moonshine from. Because it's produced under the light of the moon. And so once you actually create this product and it's sitting there up in the mountains and the thirsty folks down in Atlanta would really like their alcohol, you need to get it from point A to point B. And so the original impetus, horse carts, large trucks, Model Ts, Model As, are all kind of recruited into this operation, and that's how initially it starts to kind of come down from the foothills to the cities, but it was being noticed that more and more of these are easily intercepted, they were caught, so they needed to develop a much faster way of avoiding law enforcement. And that really kind of leads into this whole modification program. And cars and vehicles start to be modified to become faster and faster. Raymond Parks was one of the, initially a bootlegger himself who earned enough money to open up his own garage, and along with Red Voigt, a car mechanic who would become quite influential in NASCAR later on. They would modify these vehicles for bootleggers and police officers alike. Typically, it was said that the bootleggers got the better engines because they actually paid in cash and up front. And whereas the sheriff's departments had to wait for the government checks to clear, and so they got the lesser capable vehicles. So there ends up this whole entire cat and mouse happening from the foothills down, where the faster you could go, the more you could avoid law enforcement and the quicker you could get paid. And so nightly runs would be taking place between Dawsonville and North Wilkesboro down to the Atlanta area, to supply this alcohol. Also had to be handled in such a way that it wouldn't end up with a bunch of broken glass all over the back of your car. And so right before Prohibition kind of comes to a close, the Ford V8 is introduced. And the Ford V8 kind of changes the game for everyone. And I'll just go ahead and read this quote. "The balanced design created more torque, more horsepower, and more stability at high speeds. The V8 Beast and the coupe that it powered seemed tailor-made for bootlegging. Incredibly, a V8 coupe seemed to handle more nimbly the faster it went. In the South, powerful V8s left many sheriff's deputies in the dust. And once whiskey mechanics added extra carburetors to the engine and heavy tires and stronger suspension to the chassis, a Ford V8 could fly at 100 miles per hour across jagged mountain roads." And I really don't think that last statement is hyperbole. They pretty much were flying around 100 miles per hour in the dark over mountain roads that weren't designed to really handle very aggressive driving. They were rutted, they were pit, they were dirt roads. They were very challenging conditions. And with these challenging conditions develops this talent, the ones that actually get it, the ones that understand how to maneuver through it and use speed to their advantage, start to develop this talent of driving skills that they all of a sudden want to put to the test to other bootleggers. And so casually you have this development of bootleggers kind of getting together and racing and competing amongst themselves, and casually a few people might show up, and some farmers who have some open fields and land say, you know what, let's go ahead and plow some space. I want to watch this too. More people show up. Promoters start coming out of the woodwork. They start noticing that people are showing up at farmers' fields. So they might show up actually to a horse track or to a fairground. And then a lot of these promoters were also of the unscrupulous nature. And so midway through a race, you could end up with, winning the event, but not having any money because the promoter took off with the ticket sales midway through. And so this is kind of the environment of the later 1930s, early 40s that is going on. And even though Prohibition has ended at this point, there was such a blanketing of distilleries, breweries, everything is just shut down, but the stills are still up and running. So they can still provide, before big industry can kind of come and take its place, the stills are still providing plenty of alcohol for the South that bootlegging kind of continues on even past the end of Prohibition. And this is the time period, too, where Bill France kind of starts out, with his promotional ventures. Prior to the 1938, in 36 and 37, the AAA and the Elks Club had both run stock car races in Daytona to failure. But Bill France had seen success in both his 38 and 39 series that he ran. And stock car racing was developing more and more because prior to this, motorsports had really been kind of straight line racing. So from 1903 up until 1935, Daytona Beach was known as, land speed record territory. That's where, even the Sir Malcolm Campbell's Bluebird, finally set, I think the last speed record in 35 was 276 miles per hour on average. So these were incredible speeds, but they had reached their limit. The sand could no longer hold it. And so basically the speed, the speed trial folks picked up everything and it went for longer, more flatter, more solid grounds, and they found the Bonneville Salt Flats. And so that's why, the Bonneville Salt Flats after this point start picking up and having all the speed trials. But the South is left with this kind of hole, but stock car racing is kind of filling this void. And then Lakewood Speedway, or the Indianapolis Motor Speedway of the South, right outside of Atlanta, holds its largest race in 1938 on Armistice Day, with around over 20,000 fans showing up. So there's this kind of want and need for large-scale events in stock car racing. And this field that, we're starting to enter the 1940s, World War II would come in the way as well, but there were so many racing organizations that were out at this point. Some of these organizations, I'll read off some of their names, and you probably may never heard of them, but the Champion Stock Car Club, the Stock Car Racing Association, New England Stock Car Association, National Stock Car Racing Association, and more and more. There was this want and need by drivers. They wanted a legitimate, competitive, and rewarding series. But there was so fragmented, with one coming up and one going away, appearing and just disappearing kind of by, over a season, that, this is the territory that Bill France kind of steps into. And his vision was really, he founded in 1947 the National Championship Stock Car Circuit, or NCSCC. This is really the precursor to NASCAR itself. One of the novel features that he introduced was also rewarding drivers postseason. So actually, for competing through and earning points throughout the season, you could win a championship and receive a check afterwards. Most promoters and most series creators at this time period were just paying out at the race itself. And so paying out for a championship in the end was kind of like, why are you doing that? It was kind of, it was out there. But drivers appreciated that. They also appreciated knowing how much they would be winning, to have an established point system and, win so many points, earn so many dollars. And that's kind of the quote from Bill France at the top I have, is we started this championship stock car racing organization because it was needed. If the drivers and race teams follow this racing circuit, we as a group can become a stronger unit. And so this kind of lays the groundwork. This lays this trust, that starts to build over this season. So he'd go on to, complete about 40-odd races during this 1947. Fonty Flock would be declared the champion. The Flock family would be one of the first families in NASCAR. So he rides this momentum in 1947, and in December he calls a meeting at the Streamline Hotel along with Bill Tuttle, who was a promoter from the New York area that he'd worked with earlier that season, and they brought a lot of the racing representatives across from the South and the North to kind of come together to form this new unified series. And his quote, France truly believed that nothing stands still. Right here within our own group rests the outcome of stock car racing in this country today. Now, a lot of the folks in the room may not have believed him, because there had been so many series that had come and gone, that they may have just come down for a weekend of drinks and food and have a good time and sign on to a dotted line and say, okay, sure, let's start a new racing organization, and not thought much about it. So Bill France was the only candidate for president at the time, and everyone duly voted him in without objection. But later on, they kind of say, were we bamboozled? Why is he the president? And this would lead later on to, some controversies. But at the time, they decided to call themselves the National Stock Car Racing Association. Red Voigt, though, had pointed out that it was already taken, and so he suggested the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing. And since one name had already been taken, they decided, yep, okay, we'll go ahead and take this. And NASCAR is created at that point. So, really with, I kind of go back to the domino scenario. If prohibition hadn't occurred, and if that occurs, then the need for illegal alcohol to be transported to other areas creates the need for bootleggers who develop skills, who then want to compete, who then kind of, the more and more they compete, they want more legitimacy themselves, leading to sanctioning bodies being created and falling away, and then NASCAR to kind of come out of the woodwork and to kind of stand on top of the rest. So that's why I think that without prohibition there couldn't have been NASCAR. And the next regulatory issue that I want to talk about was really the 1970 Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act. Now, with this, it was an attempt by the U.S. government to prevent advertising on television and radio of cigarette ads. Now, you might not think that that's that big of a deal, one or two ads here and there. It's an adult's decision whether or not to pick up cigarettes and start smoking. Well, they were spending, roughly 80% of their entire budget of the cigarette industry as a whole was being spent on TV ads. And, spending only $150 million doesn't sound like much, but if you adjust for inflation, this is over $1 billion in advertising on television alone. And then if we go back even further, because we're so used to cable television, streaming networks, local TV, there were only 3 major networks. It was ABC, NBC, and CBS. And so 3 television stations had $1 billion worth of cigarette advertising on them throughout the year. That's a lot of cigarette advertising. And so with this, and then even some of these ads that I kind of pulled, it was of the vein of more doctors smoke Camels. And also the Flintstones, basically go through and astound the benefits of smoking smooth filtered Winston cigarettes. So, when you have major cartoon characters telling you to smoke cigarettes, maybe we've reached a point. So, with this being said, the bill is signed into law April of 1970, and it actually goes into effect January 2nd of 1971, just in time for the NASCAR season. So, being with this, since the writing was kind of on the wall, the bill had been signed, had been passed by Nixon, signed by Nixon. Junior Johnson kind of steps back into the picture. At this time, a lot of the major car manufacturers were starting to step away. Ford, Dodge, Chrysler, a lot of their major factory teams were kind of stepped back. Some of the engineering support was being pulled away, and so was leaving this hole of finance. And so Junior Johnson said, well, you know what, I'm going to go approach R.J. Reynolds. They're just up the road. They're based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Junior was around the Charlotte area. And so he just took the hour-and-a-half drive up and proposed that, how about R.J. Reynolds pays me $200,000 for sponsorship if that's, if it sounds good, and keep my team going. And they basically turned to him and said, well, what can you do with several $1 million? And he said, sponsorship doesn't usually work that way. You asking for one amount and you 10 to a million times getting it back to me, so that I'm not used to this. So after he gets over the initial shock, he realizes that even with that amount of money, he wouldn't be able to do it justice. He wouldn't be able to do what R.J. Reynolds wanted to do. And so he introduced R.J. Reynolds, spokesman Ralph Seagraves, who would go on to manage the majority of this promotion and oversee it really, and Bill France Jr. So after multiple meetings, they came out, and the first ever title sponsorship for NASCAR is created, the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. And so really, this new standard for commercial partnership in motorsports is kind of founded with this, because tobacco needed to move their money out of TV and into something else. That next year's spending of $1 billion was already slated, and so they needed to put it somewhere. And NASCAR seemed to fit the bill. And so with this, they redirect the majority of their budgets, but they also redirect a huge majority of their expertise. NASCAR at this point was a regional sport. You know, it had some national attention here and there. It was talked about, but it really didn't have much television coverage, didn't have much press coverage, and wasn't known outside of the South to a great extent. And so Winston basically all of a sudden brings, like, almost takes NASCAR out of the Model T and puts it in the Ford V8 and just sends it down the road. And they start rocketing down with billboards and media coverage and the thing called a press conference, you know, and actually making drivers available for media interactions through through telephone calls, through flying media in from major organizations to a race to actually cover said race. And, you know, they pay for track improvements. They tell them to move their award banquet, you know, basically to the New York City's Waldorf Astoria, because anything at this point that happens in New York is in national news. And so they also direct their sport marketing enterprise to become the unofficial PR hub for NASCAR. So they take it, you know, pretty much away from the one guy who might have been talking to the press after the race to all of a sudden a New York-backed, you know, PR group that is now promoting everything about NASCAR. And along with this, you know, there do come some challenges. Now, you know, R.J. Reynolds is really looking to nationalize NASCAR. They're looking to see how they can take this regional series and make it nationally recognizable, and to make our investment worthwhile so that we get the most exposure, you know, in front of the United States as we can, as opposed to what they used to get with, you know, paying, you know, roughly $1 billion a year for TV coverage. And so they suggest different improvements. The racing schedules reduced dramatically from 48 races down to about 31 races within a year. A lot of the smaller venues, a lot of 150-mile races, 200-mile races are all replaced. 400, 500-mile races are taking place. The idea of high-profile events are introduced, you know, to get people really excited on a national level. The Winston Million, the Winston or the All-Star race are introduced during this time period as well. And what's also interesting about the Winston Million is, you know, it's, you know, if you don't know the whole backstory, so the Winston, I'll go with a small tangent. So the Winston Million was basically a promotional idea. It's like, how can we get more people entertained or engaged with, you know, NASCAR racing? Well, what if we give $1 million to the one driver who wins 3 out of the 4 hardest races? Okay, sure. You know, is that possible? And most officials and most drivers are like, nah, it's not possible. It's like, okay, well, that sounds like an even better bet. We can say we're going to give them $1 million, and then if no one wins it, then fantastic. You know, perfect. And so what are these races? Okay, it's going to be the Daytona 500, it's going to be Talladega, it's going to be the Charlotte 600, and it's going to be Darlington. And wouldn't you know it, you know, they didn't take out really any liability type insurance or kind of, you know, gift insurance, you know, contest insurance on this thing. And Bill Elliott wins it in the first year. So, lo and behold, the impossible happens, and so they're on the hook. You know, they were on the hook for the full $1 million. So there wasn't like, you know, there wasn't any insurance companies involved that, you know, prize indemnification or anything of that nature. But yeah, that was the very first year that they introduced the program. Bill Elliott wins it, and they sure indemnified that thing afterwards. But it wouldn't be until 1997 where a fresh-faced Jeff Gordon would actually win the final Winston Million. And so, for, you know, for their knowledge, yeah, that's a long time to go without, you know, having winners. You know, so it did make sense when they initially did it, but they're like, shoot, we got to pay this. So lessons learned, but it did capture the national attentions. I mean, you know, we even to this day, you know, famous Awesome Bill from Dawsonville, you know, kind of comes out of the woodwork every now and then. So with this, they invest millions in the tracks. They pour money to improve grandstands. They actually have been known. They were known to have saved several tracks from bankruptcy, paying off some bills. Red and white paint all of a sudden becomes the normal paint for all these race facilities. Winston was painted every 100 yards down the backstretch, you know, stripes to induce, you know, when they actually got on TV, so the stripes would look faster as the cars are moving. You know, it was this whole kind of mindset of raising the bar. And with this, all these improvements that go along, and more people are coming out and watching these events, television is catching on. So they go from having just recorded segments on worldwide sports to having the start of the race to the end of the race, kind of cutting in, to finally CBS taking the leap in 1979 for the first flag-to-flag broadcast live coverage of the Daytona 500, which ended in a very dramatic finish of a fight happening in the backstretch. And this all happened in front of millions of people because there coincidentally happened to be a blizzard that limited everyone's ability to leave their house, and they're stuck in front of the TV. And again, there are only 3 TV stations to choose from. And if your choices are, 1, 2, or 3, and one of those has a race on, you're going to watch the thing with the race. And that viewership record actually wasn't broken until about the 2010s. So that was a phenomenal catch for NASCAR with this 1979 race to entice so many people to become interested in the series itself. And with Winston's investment into the series, they were said to have invested around $60 million annually in the series. So with inflation, of course, that number grows quite exponentially. So it's a lot of multiple millions of dollars being invested into tracks, to personnel, but it gave a steady, a good financial base that they could operate off of. And the prize money, as you can see, rapidly increased in a fairly short amount of time. 1964, if you won the 500, the prize pool itself was only $100,000. By 74, it was $250,000. By 79, it was $538,000, and by 85, it was well over $1 million. So prize pools started to increase drastically, and with this long-term investment that Winston had made into the sport was just paying off, and drivers were starting to reap the benefits of it, and also on a national scale was being established as the premier stock car racing organization that it is today. And not to be outdone, but around the same time period, IMSA benefits from this as well. So a brief recap of IMSA's creation. John Bishop, had worked with the SCCA and parted ways. And Bill France had considered starting a new sports car sanctioning body. And he called up John Bishop, and he said, why don't you come down to Daytona, let's talk about it. I'd hate for your experience to go to waste. And once they got together and they talked, and Bill France said, I'll make a large initial investment. Let's get this off the ground and running. So the International Motorsports Association was founded in 1969 with its first emphasis on Formula Fords and Formula Vs. Bill France ended up owning 75% initially of IMSA. That was paid off by John Bishop by, I think, 1976 or so. He had paid off all of France's investments, and so he owned it himself. But the initial IMSA suffered from a lot of, some bad press, some accidents, and only 500 people showing up to Talladega, which would look really awkward to see only 500 people at a race at Talladega. So with that being said, there was a refocus on sports cars. So by 1970, the Formula Vs and Formula Fords kind of were pulled a little bit back, and sports cars were going to be the next big thing. And R.J. Reynolds. Now, this was not actually a Bill France introducing R.J. Reynolds to John Bishop. This was kind of just a natural progression. I couldn't really find any proof that one introduced the other. But it happened to be R.J. Reynolds as well, and through their Camel brand. And through their Camel brand in 1972, Camel comes in and basically provides that critical funding that IMSA needed to really gain eyeballs, on the racetrack. And so there's a very quick growth and all of a sudden credibility, international, just recognition of, if I said IMSA GT and it's a series that started last year, what's that? But if you say Camel GT, it's like, well, I know Camel cigarettes, and if they're behind it, well, it must be something. So let me at least take a look at it. And just through that, the race calendars open up, more tracks kind of open up, and will accept an IMSA race to appear. Top talent kind of comes out of the woodworks. The manufacturers come out once the Camel GTP prototype type classes come out from Porsche, Jaguar, Nissan, Toyota, Lola, Lotus, just so many manufacturers kind of come out of the woodwork, so all the different classes that are introduced, that, throughout the 70s and 80s, they just kind of ride this wave. And so with that being said, there's this whole idea kind of that the public needs protecting from cigarettes. That was the original policy attempt, to take eyeballs off cigarettes and take it off television. Well, pretty much it had the unintended consequence of shifting everything to motorsports, something that was in front of people's eyeballs already, and through the influx of cash from these companies, got in front of even more eyeballs, and just spread itself out even more across the country than they had originally even been intended to. And, they basically created this symbiotic relationship where the success of one proved the success of the other. So, with the funds and the advertising, kind of came along and dragged motorsports along with it. It got better cars, it got better talent, it got better racing. It just became a better sporting organization through IMSA and through NASCAR itself. And you had a better product to put out on the track. And, really, that's kind of what that's kind of what I wanted to say. So, thank you.
That was
Yeah.
that was great. Much more interesting than what I thought it was going to be. That was a great
thank you.
presentation. I don't know where I came up with this lame 5-mile-an-hour bumper thing. Anyway, that was terrific. Do we have any questions for Quinn? While Dwight's getting in, or Dwayne, I'm sorry, when did this all end? Was there a year or two that this all actually ended?
So I believe it was right around 1998, there was another act that basically came into involved that basically prevented cigarette advertising in sporting events, basically. And so that's when a lot of this kind of went away. Camel cigarettes kind of dipped out around 93, 94 or so, so they were a little bit earlier. And then Winston wasn't until about 2003 that they left. And so, it was basically another government regulation that kind of stepped in and said, no, you can't have this giant platform to advertise on, which they kind of caused in the first place.
Questions?
Off topic a bit, did any of the bootleggers turn into major alcohol manufacturers? You mentioned that the large corporations eventually took that business away from them, but did they themselves develop into a major corporation?
The type of alcohol that was produced was a very strong, referred to as white lightning. And so that, basically kind of stayed as it was. But funny you should mention, Junior Johnson actually had his own brand, Midnight Moon, which kind of he launched himself and basically made legal moonshine and then packaged and paid the tax stamp on later in life. And so it kind of took, his historical connections to it and just used it as a marketing ploy. But it was still just a straight in a mason jar, just.
So he never tried to develop.
No,
into the
he
Seagrams of the
went on.
world.
He did well. His father was known to have been the largest East Coast bust of moonshine on record at the time when his family farm was impounded and all the alcohol was taken out. He himself was arrested for distilling and spent a year and a half or so in federal penitentiary, which Ronald Reagan actually years later pardoned him for. So he got that off his record later on. But no, that's about the only one that I could know that kind of went and kind of rode it on out. Most of them kind of got out of the business or passed away, because of it. So.
I'm curious how your presentation interfaces with the first one we saw this morning about the Winston Cup West and what that kind of transition from a southern sport to a national sport looked like under Winston's sponsorship.
My main focus was more on the national level, so I was actually really intrigued by Dan's presentation this morning of the Winston West Series itself. But I believe that, with Winston's money, there was able to be a secondary Western series, and you had the development of sub-series below NASCAR itself to be a feeder into the main series later on. Yeah, and you might have much more insight since your family was involved in it.
They still wanted to spend more money, and they wanted to boost the West Coast series, so they allotted X amount of dollars to come to the West Coast to get it going to be competitive with these.
Yeah. So, yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. Because like I said, mine was strictly research on the national level and not subcategory.
So in the late 1950s, there was a Robert Mitchum film, Thunder Road, about moonshiners and bootleggers. You're probably familiar with it, or?
A little bit.
I was wondering if you knew anything or anybody had any speculation about how that would impact NASCAR, because it was, for a lot of America, it was an introduction to Appalachian culture, and there was a whole different side of America's social structure that was popularized by that film.
Yeah, and actually NASCAR, even its very beginnings, once in the late 40s, early 50s, never really wanted to be associated almost with bootlegging. So in its original impetus, when it was trying to make a name for itself and become popular, before Winston stepped in, they pretty much kind of denied that there were any kind of criminal activities or anything that kind of inspired this. It was all France's idea, and they all came together in the spirit of competition to make this series and become legal and legitimate, and clean as a whistle, basically. And so it wasn't until really, mid 2000s or 2010s that this acceptance of, okay, fine, it did happen. A lot of these bootleggers, there's a lot of the technology that kind of went into it, the skills learned on the back roads, going into the dirt tracks, going into the major racing events, the families that kind of got their start from that. Raymond Parks was one of the first, multi-car team owners at the very start of NASCAR, and all his money came from slot machines, gambling, and running alcohol into Atlanta. And there were multiple drivers who, and that's kind of also another reason that Charlotte kind of became a hub for NASCAR, is that Atlanta and their the rich people of Atlanta and the religious leaders of Atlanta didn't want criminality associated and running on Sundays, and so they basically forced a lot of the local government plus the police to kind of arrest these drivers because they knew they were racing at Lakewood, they knew they were going to be there, and they were kind of just snubbing their nose at society, and they wouldn't stand for it, but Charlotte was like, come on down, and so they were fine with it. And, so that's kind of why, we don't have Atlanta as kind of like the hub for NASCAR, as opposed to Charlotte, so.
All right, Quinn, our very active live streamers. First of all,
Oh, boy.
Mark Howell said, stop stealing my thunder. And Ash Vandelay writes, we see constant complaints online that NASCAR isn't like it used to be. Would we say that's because of the lack of money to pump into various marketing efforts, or maybe an accumulation of things?
Yeah, I'd say it's accumulation of things. With Winston's influx and this is my opinion, with the rise of NASCAR as it was throughout the 70s and even into the early 2000s, and then all of a sudden we see this kind of switch over. Nextel Cup, all of a sudden Tech is involved, and they become the series sponsor, which then switches into Sprint because of a buyout. But the early aughts and of the 2000s see this enormous influx. It's almost like everyone's tripping over themselves to invest tens of millions of dollars in sponsorship money into these races, and it seemed to have almost been worked up to a fever pitch, and then everyone started investing, and then 2008 hits, and everyone stops investing. And you see kind of like pullbacks on sponsorships. You go from full seasons having the exact same car, sponsored by Home Depot and Lowe's and M&M's, and FedEx is one of the last remaining ones right now. But these single company sponsors for an entire season just seem to disappear overnight. And there was facilities that had constantly relied on full seats and huge waiting lists, to get into, the Bristol night race, just all of a sudden vanished, and there were tickets available, whereas for years they'd been just, waiting lists and season ticket holders only. And there's been an adjustment. I mean, there's been ups and downs in every sport, so, I think we're correcting back out, but to kind of more sustainable, kind of where we're at right now in NASCAR. But, what the future holds, we'll see. So, hope that answers that.
I was just going to add, I missed the beginning. I'm sorry, because I was out taking care of some business.
Okay, well, prohibitions.
No, wait, no.
Anything for you, Lynn.
Well done, by the way, because I think it is a fascinating business story of how this has all evolved. But have you been in to the NASCAR R&D Center?
I've been down once or twice.
Inside?
Yeah, inside.
Yeah. So when you go in after you get past the front desk area, off to the right, that large room, that sign that's on, have you seen what's literally written on the wall?
Okay, I've missed that one.
And I wish I had written it down, but it's a quote from Bill France when at the meeting that he was with all of in the formation of NASCAR.
Yeah.
And it makes reference to we can do the same thing but better than those guys in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
That was like a driving, motivating force. I don't know how accurate that is, but it's up on the wall at the R&D Center, so I figure it's probably true.
Okay, so that does take a little bit away from, I was trying to structure it more toward prohibition. But yes, there was a big influx fight. There have been tales, and how true they are or not, of Bill France being at Indianapolis or so, AAA the sanctioning body kind of finding out that he was even in the garages and going, oh, he's not supposed to be here, and kicking him out. And, even at times he had tried to approach him, or even had considered kind of teaming up to hey, AAA, you've got this experience. How about I come in as your stock car representative, and we kind of run this stock car series, together. And just AAA was having none of it. They just kind of thumbed their noses at it. They just really, it's basically like a third-rate racing series for the working class is basically kind of how they thought of stock car racing. Eventually, they would turn around and start trying their own stock car racing series once they saw that something was occurring and happening after France had established NASCAR. It was a little too late. And Bill was very authoritative of, if you went to another series, you lost your points, you were blackballed and, not accepted back, and there are all sorts of consequences they stuck to pretty firmly. He ruled NASCAR quite with an iron fist. But in one hand, if he I don't think it would have.
If it was up there, I figured it had to be at least an accurate quote.
Yes,
and,
it is.
And a driving force. And then my only little comment was when it was the Camel Series, and I just remember I was going to Brainerd to race in the IMSA race there, and I was supposed to go to the media center, and I was late. I got rental car. I was in this little Escort with my foot totally to the floor trying to get there in time, and just could imagine in a rental car just hauling butt, and all of a sudden I look up and I see this huge billboard, Camel GT with "Where a Man Belongs," and all of a sudden I was like, what the hell am I working so hard to get there for? It was just so funny because the other was that how with Marlboro, with their sponsorship, that when they got pulled because of the law, right? But then I think Penske kept the color scheme so that you really didn't even miss that Marlboro wasn't on there. I mean, it's just interesting visually how the identification can carry forward even if the letters aren't there.
Yeah, stay tuned. Welcome back to 2026 or 2025 when I introduced the European regulations, a little forefront that. But yes, Mission Winnow is also one of those fun things that we're going to be talking about. But that goes back to a nonsensical what is it type company that sort of is funded by and it's just the shape of it at speed looks like a Marlboro pack, so it's kind of fun.
All right, Quinn, one more before we yield to Aldo, who's waiting in Italy. Mark Howell writes, how much has the use of wraps promoted/enabled the rash of one-off sponsors?
Ooh, gosh. I think it's really helped, but I think it's also helped to the extent of it's also been a really good boon to the industry, because if For example, Coca-Cola has many variations of Coca-Cola. Diet Coke, Coke Zero, Cherry Coke, Pumpkin Coke, I'm sure will come out someday. Oreos and Coke came out not that long ago, which is disgusting. But regardless of that, these single car wraps can be utilized to promote every single product line that a major corporation might have. So I think it's quite nice that this technology exists, that if you do pitch a corporation, that not only is it Coca-Cola being sold, but you can go ahead and weekly switch out to your next product line or your next marketing innovation that you want to promote to the nation. And you can make it even regional. If you had a particular product that sells better in one spot or the other, if you had a conglomerate of supermarkets, you could change it out from what area you're in, which is that particular supermarket or convenience store that you might be sponsored by. So in that effect, I do think it's quite nice to have.
Quinn, it wasn't just cigarettes. It was chewing tobacco. Copenhagen and Skoal were major players in NASCAR and IndyCar. They had the Skoal Motorsports report that was coast to coast on radio. And
good old Skoal Bandit.
So that affected a lot of different things.
Yeah, no, it's very true. Yeah, on the team level, there were many more brands that kind of got involved, but I think Winston, with its exclusivity as a top sponsor, kind of squashed a lot of the smaller companies from being able to kind of do the single car sponsorship stuff. So, any other questions?
I think we need to make room for Aldo, but Quinn, that was terrific. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.